He trusted his fiancée with his future, until a 9-year-old girl exposed what was really in her bag. What she discovered on a forgotten tablet could have saved hundreds of lives. Lucy sat on the edge of the velvet armchair that felt too large for her small frame, her legs tucked up beneath her as if she could vanish into the fabric. The mansion was quiet, but not in the peaceful way she had once imagined rich houses might be. It was the kind of quiet that came from people who lived with walls between them, walls built of money and work and secrets. She had been placed here 2 weeks ago, another foster home on a long list she carried silently inside her heart. But she knew already that this house was different. Not because of the glass walls that looked out over the city, or the chandeliers that glittered like stars, but because of the way the people inside moved. Damien Wolfe, the man who had signed the papers to bring her here, hardly looked at her at all. When he did, it was with the distracted air of someone glancing at a clock before a meeting. He was tall and sharp in his tailored suits, his dark hair never out of place, his voice even and low as he spoke into phones or stared at glowing screens late into the night. Lucy watched him from doorways, from stairwells, from the shadowed corners, where children learned to linger unseen. He gave her everything she needed, but he gave it the way someone signed checks, efficient and detached. A room painted in colors she had never chosen, shelves filled with books and toys that still smelled of plastic and paper, clothes that fit perfectly but felt like costumes. He had done what was expected, but not what was needed. Celeste, on the other hand, smiled too much. Her beauty was flawless, her movements graceful, her voice soft like a song that never stopped playing. But Lucy saw the flicker behind her eyes, the way her mouth tightened before she laughed, the way her hands gripped her phone too tightly when she thought no one was looking. At night, Lucy heard her voice drifting down the hall, low and urgent, the words hidden but the tone sharp, clipped, like someone arranging pieces on a board only she could see. When she hung up, she would glide back into the kitchen or Damien's study with the perfect mask of calm, but Lucy had already seen the truth beneath it. She told herself to stay quiet. In her other homes, she had learned what happened when children said too much. But here, in this house of glass and silence, her eyes grew sharper, her ears keener. She noticed the way Damien never asked where Celeste had been, never questioned why she left rooms just before important calls, never caught the way she slipped his office key from the silver dish by the door and slid it into her purse as if it belonged to her. Lucy was only 9, but she had already learned that survival meant seeing things others ignored. She watched, and she remembered, and she carried those small details like stones in her pocket. She didn't know yet what they meant, but she knew they mattered. And as she sat in the armchair, small and silent in the cavernous room, she promised herself that if no one else was going to notice the cracks in the glass walls around them, she would. The grand hall of Wolfe Aerospace headquarters gleamed under lights that reflected off polished marble floors and walls lined with banners carrying the silver logo of the company. Cameras flashed as journalists filled the room, their voices a steady hum of anticipation. At the center stood Damien Wolfe, tall and commanding in a navy suit, his expression calm but proud. He spoke into the microphone with the assurance of a man who had built an empire from blueprints and risk, announcing to the world that the WolfeJet X9 would take its first flight within days. His voice carried across the hall, steady and confident, promising innovation, safety, and the dawn of a new age of private aviation. Investors leaned forward in their seats, government officials nodded in approval, and reporters typed furiously on their laptops, eager to capture every word. Celeste Morgan stood just behind him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile dazzling as cameras turned toward her. She looked every bit the devoted fiancée, her emerald dress catching the light as she leaned closer, as though she belonged at the heart of the empire Damien had built. To the crowd, she was elegance and charm, but Lucy watched from the side of the stage, clutching her small tablet against her chest, and noticed the subtle way Celeste's eyes darted around the room. They flicked toward the journalists, toward the exit doors, toward Damien's briefcase on the table beside the podium. The smile never wavered, but Lucy could see the calculation beneath it, the sharpness in her gaze that didn't match the warmth in her face. Damien lifted his hand toward the large screen behind him, where the sleek silver jet filled the display. The WolfeJet X9 gleamed like a vision from the future, its wings crafted with new alloys, its engines designed to reduce fuel consumption, its systems so advanced they could be flown with minimal crew. It was his greatest creation, a plane that could reshape the industry and secure his legacy. He spoke of the maiden flight with pride, describing how dignitaries, investors, and world leaders would join him on board. It was not just a test of engineering, he told them, but a demonstration of power and progress. The applause was loud and eager, the sound of wealth and influence bound to his success. Lucy shifted in her chair, her small fingers gripping the edge of the tablet until her knuckles turned white. She felt a weight pressing into her chest as she listened. She had heard Celeste on the phone the night before, her voice low and sharp as she said words Lucy didn't understand completely. Words like delivery and timing and midair. Those words clung to her now, sticky and heavy, as she watched Damien speak of triumph. The audience saw a man on the edge of greatness, but Lucy saw the shadow of danger in the smile beside him. She wished she could run onto the stage and whisper in his ear the way she had done at home, but the hall was too big, the eyes too many, and Damien's attention fixed on the flashing lights of the cameras. No one noticed the little girl holding a tablet tighter than she ever had before, no one but Celeste, who let her eyes flicker toward Lucy for the briefest second, sharp and cold, before turning back to beam at the crowd. The mansion was quiet that night, quiet in the way that made Lucy's skin prickle. Damien had retreated to his study, the glow of his screen spilling into the hall like a pale lantern, while Celeste had glided upstairs with her phone pressed to her ear. Lucy should have been asleep, but sleep rarely came easily here. Instead, she wandered softly down the corridor in her socks, her tablet clutched under one arm, listening to the hum of voices that didn't belong. It was then she heard it, the sharp whisper slipping through the half-open door of the guest room Celeste had claimed as her own. Lucy paused, holding her breath. Celeste's voice was low, urgent, clipped in a way she never used when Damien was around. "The delivery is secured," she murmured. "Everything will be in place. It has to happen mid-air or there's no point." Her tone was tight, every word edged with control. Lucy's heart thumped so hard she thought it might give her away. She had heard voices like that before, back in houses where danger wore polite smiles, and she knew the difference between harmless secrets and words that carried harm. She crouched closer, peeking through the crack in the door. Celeste's back was to her, her reflection caught faintly in the tall mirror as she paced the room, phone pressed tight, eyes glittering like sharp glass. "Wolfe will never suspect," Celeste continued, her voice soft but deadly. "He's blinded by pride. Timing is everything. Once the flight is in motion, there's no turning back." She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end, then laughed lightly, a laugh without warmth. "Don't worry. By the time anyone realizes, it will all look like an accident." Lucy's stomach twisted. She wanted to run into the room and shout, to grab the phone from Celeste's hand and throw it against the wall. But she stayed still. Children in foster homes learned quickly that charging at danger only left bruises. Watching, listening, remembering, that was how you survived. When Celeste ended the call, slipping her phone into her silk robe pocket, Lucy darted back into the shadows. She padded down the hall and curled into the corner outside Damien's study, waiting for the sound of his typing to slow. When it did, she stepped inside, her small figure framed by the doorway. Damien looked up, distracted, his glasses reflecting the pale light of code scrolling across his screen. "Lucy," he said, voice even, "it's late. You should be in bed." "I need to tell you something," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "She's planning something. Celeste. She said there's going to be a delivery and it has to happen mid-air. She said it will look like an accident." Damien's brows drew together, his mouth tightening into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as though considering a puzzle. "Lucy, you have a vivid imagination. You're safe here. Celeste wouldn't hurt anyone." "But I heard her," Lucy insisted, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She was talking about the flight. He sighed, his eyes flicking back to the glowing screen. Sometimes when we're young, we misunderstand things. Don't worry yourself with grown-up conversations. Celeste cares about you. She wouldn't say anything dangerous. Lucy stood there, her chest burning with frustration, knowing she was right but helpless against the weight of adult dismissal. Damien turned back to his screen, the rhythm of his typing resuming, while Lucy lingered in the doorway, her voice swallowed by the soft hum of machines. She walked away in silence, clutching her tablet to her chest, the echo of Celeste's whispers heavy in her ears. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the dining room, catching on crystal glasses and polished silverware until the table seemed to glow. Damien sat at the head of the table, scanning through emails on his tablet with one hand, while his other wrapped loosely around a steaming cup of coffee. Celeste sat near him, her perfect smile in place, dressed in pale silk that shimmered as she leaned forward to talk about the upcoming flight and the press who would be covering it. Everything about the scene was composed to look calm and ordinary, but Lucy felt the weight of the night before pressing into her chest like a stone. She sat quietly at the far end of the table, her plate of food untouched, her small hands twisting in her lap as she gathered courage. She watched Damien carefully, waiting for his eyes to lift from the glowing screen. When they did, she leaned forward just enough so her voice could reach him without carrying too far. Her whisper was small but certain. "She'll take it down." The coffee cup stopped halfway to Damien's lips. For a moment he froze, the words settling over him like ash. His gaze flicked toward Lucy, startled. But before he could form a response, Celeste's laughter filled the room, warm and musical, wrapping around them like a ribbon. "Oh, Damien," she said, her voice light with amusement. "Children have the most vivid imaginations. I'm sure she's been reading too many adventure stories before bed." Her eyes slid toward Lucy, not cold exactly, but sharp, the kind of look that told Lucy she had crossed a line. Damien's jaw tightened. He set the cup down with deliberate care, forcing his shoulders to relax. The silence stretched for a breath too long before he cleared his throat and tried to smile. "Lucy, sweetheart, you shouldn't worry yourself with things like that. It's just nerves. The flight will be perfectly safe." Lucy shook her head, her voice rising just slightly, trembling but firm. "No," she said it. "I heard her. She's planning it." Celeste's hand fluttered to her chest in mock shock. "Planning what?" "Darling, listen to her. She's frightened of shadows. You work too much. She probably feels left out, and now she's inventing wild stories." She leaned closer to Damien, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate while still carrying across the table. "Maybe we should consider a therapist for her. Adjustment isn't easy for children, especially with her background." Damien forced a chuckle that did not reach his eyes. He could feel the weight of reporters, investors, and staff who would soon be watching him in the coming days. He could not allow rumors of instability in his own home, not now. With a sharp nod toward the waiting security guard in the corner, he gave the order without words. The guard stepped forward, gentle but firm as he touched Lucy's shoulder. "Come along, miss." Lucy stiffened, her face flushing red as she tried to hold Damien's gaze. Her lips parted as though to speak again, but the words died in her throat when she saw the strain in his forced smile. She let the guard guide her out of the dining room, her small frame shrinking under the weight of being dismissed once again. As the door closed behind her, Damien turned back to Celeste, whose smile had softened into a look of sweet concern. He tried to return it, lifting his coffee once more, but the taste was bitter now. Inside his chest, doubt stirred like a spark he tried to smother, while the echo of Lucy's whisper lingered, quiet and insistent. The hangar was alive with sound and light. Banners hung from the steel beams, and the gleaming WolfeJet X9 stood at the center like a jewel. Guests in elegant suits and shimmering gowns sipped champagne while photographers circled, their cameras flashing in bursts that reflected off the polished body of the aircraft. Damien moved through the crowd with Celeste on his arm, shaking hands, nodding at investors, his voice low but steady as he spoke about the future of aviation. From a distance, he looked calm, but inside he felt the weight of every eye on him. This flight was not just a test of his creation, it was a test of his worth. Lucy stood near the back of the crowd, her small body almost swallowed by the sea of adults. She clutched her tablet tightly against her chest, her eyes darting between Damien and Celeste. Celeste was radiant in pale gold, her smile flawless as she leaned close to whisper in Damien's ear, her hand resting possessively on his sleeve. No one else noticed the flicker in her eyes, the brief glance toward the plane as though she were measuring something unseen. Lucy had heard too much already, and her stomach twisted with the knowledge that this moment was a trap. The speeches began, the hum of anticipation filling the hangar. Damien stood at the podium, his voice carrying over the microphone as he spoke about innovation and progress, about safety, and the trust that his company inspired. The crowd applauded, the sound echoing against the steel walls, but Lucy could no longer keep still. Her hands shook as she stepped forward, pushing past tall figures who looked down at her with surprise. Her voice broke the polished rhythm of the event, small but sharp, cutting through the air. "She's dangerous," Lucy shouted, pointing at Celeste with trembling hands. "She'll take it down. She'll hurt everyone." The hangar fell silent. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, cameras swung toward the small figure at the front, and gasps rippled through the crowd. Celeste's expression faltered for only a breath. Then she placed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with practiced tears. "Oh, Damien," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough for those closest to hear. "What is she saying?" The poor child must be so confused. She turned to the crowd with a look of pure anguish, her hand trembling as if wounded by the accusation. She's been through so much. Please don't judge her for these stories. She doesn't know what she's saying. Damien's face tightened as every camera turned toward him. Investors leaned closer, whispering, uncertain, and the air grew heavy with expectation. He felt the pressure to act, to restore calm, to protect his reputation and the image of his company. A sharp nod was all it took. 2 security guards stepped forward and gripped Lucy by the arms. She fought against them, her small voice cracking as she cried out again. "She's lying. She's not who she says she is. She'll destroy the plane." The crowd murmured uneasily as the guards pulled her back, her feet scraping against the polished floor, her cries echoing against the steel body of the jet. Damien stood frozen for a moment, his coffee, brown eyes flicking between Celeste's trembling form and Lucy's desperate face. He forced a smile, his jaw tight, and addressed the crowd as if nothing had happened. But inside, the echo of her words clung to him like smoke from a fire he could not yet see. The party in the hangar had continued after Lucy was dragged away, but for Damien the applause had turned hollow. He had smiled for the investors, shaken hands with politicians, and nodded for photographs beside the gleaming WolfeJet X9, yet beneath the surface his thoughts circled endlessly around the small figure who had shouted in front of everyone. The echo of her voice clung to him, sharp and unsettling. He had been humiliated, his fiancée had been forced to comfort the crowd, and his reputation had been left with a faint crack in its surface. But what lingered was not the embarrassment, it was the certainty in Lucy's eyes. He remembered the way she had stood there, tiny in her plain dress, her hands shaking, but her voice steady. She had not sounded like a child telling a wild story. She had sounded like someone who knew too much. Damien told himself it was nonsense, that trauma made children say strange things, that she had picked up words from somewhere and woven them into a scene that ruined his night. But each time he repeated that excuse to himself, he saw again the flicker in Celeste's gaze, the way she had quickly shifted from shock to pity, the way she had embraced the role of victim as if she had rehearsed it. When the last guest had gone and the hangar fell silent, Damien had driven home in the long black car with Celeste resting her head against his shoulder. She whispered reassurances, told him not to worry, reminded him that children sometimes acted out for attention. He nodded. He agreed. He even kissed her hair as though soothed, but his mind was elsewhere. Lucy's words repeated like a low drum beat. She'll take it down. In the darkness of his bedroom that night, with Celeste sleeping peacefully beside him, Damien lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every odd moment that he had brushed aside returned to him now with unbearable clarity. He remembered the times Celeste had known details about meetings he had not shared, the way she carried her phone with her at all times, the way she had insisted on giving him that painting for his office, the one Lucy had pointed to weeks ago when she whispered about a blinking light. He remembered the faint smell of his cologne on her hands one evening when she claimed she had been tidying his desk, though he never recalled asking her to. Each small detail piled one upon another until his chest grew tight. Sleep would not come. He rose, poured a drink, and stood by the window that overlooked the city. The skyline glowed with scattered lights, steady and dependable, unlike the shifting ground beneath his own home. For years, Damien had built his company on discipline and logic, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. Yet here he was, torn between the dazzling woman who had captured his affection and the silent child who had done nothing but watch. He closed his eyes, Lucy's face filling his thoughts, her quiet intensity, her sharp eyes that saw what others missed. She had no reason to lie. She had no advantage to gain. And that truth, simple and stark, kept him awake until dawn. The morning after the ceremony, the house felt heavy, as though the air itself carried the weight of unspoken things. Damien sat in the library with his head bent over a file of contracts, but the words blurred together and refused to settle. He had not slept, and though he tried to convince himself that fatigue was the reason, the truth was that Lucy's voice still echoed inside him. Every time he looked at the polished surface of his desk, he saw her small face, pale with urgency, and heard again the words she had spoken in front of investors and journalists. He told himself it was childish nonsense, yet the certainty in her tone refused to leave. It was Margaret who finally disturbed the silence. She entered softly, carrying a tray of tea, her gray hair tied back, her expression calm but serious. She placed the tray in front of him with steady hands, then stood waiting until he looked up. Damien saw the resolve in her eyes, the kind of resolve that came from years of watching families unravel and mend again, from knowing when to speak and when to hold her tongue. "Mr. Wolfe," she said gently, "I wouldn't usually interfere, but I think you need to hear this." He sighed, leaning back in his chair, preparing himself for a lecture about patience and children. "If this is about Lucy, Margaret, I've already decided how to handle it. She embarrassed us both last night. Celeste was mortified. Investors are asking questions. She cannot be allowed to invent stories like that." Margaret did not flinch. Her voice stayed steady. "Lucy does not invent stories. Not the way you think. She observes. She remembers. She pieces things together more clearly than most adults I know. I've seen her, Mr. Wolfe. She watches everything." Damien frowned, but something in her tone stopped him from interrupting. Margaret clasped her hands in front of her, choosing her words with care. "I've noticed things myself. Miss Celeste often carries luggage into the house that seems heavier than it should be, even when she claims it is only clothes or gifts. I have seen her slip into restricted rooms when she thought no one was looking. Your father's old office, the locked cabinet in the study. When I asked her once if she needed help, she startled like someone caught, then smiled too quickly." Damien's chest tightened as he listened. Margaret's words fit too neatly with the thoughts that had plagued him through the night. She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Lucy is not prone to fantasy, sir. That child has been through more than most, and she has learned to survive by seeing the truth in people's faces. I've watched her. She does not speak without reason." He turned away, staring at the shelves lined with books he had never opened. He wanted to dismiss Margaret's concerns the way he had dismissed Lucy's, but doubt was already growing too strong. Margaret placed a hand on the edge of his desk, her voice soft but firm. "Please do not ignore her, Mr. Wolfe. She may be the only one telling you what you need to hear." For a long time, Damien said nothing. He heard only the faint ticking of the clock and the echo of Lucy's whisper. The walls of certainty he had built around Celeste trembled, and though he longed to steady them, Margaret's words had driven a crack straight through the middle. The evening air in the mansion was cool and still, broken only by the faint hum of machines from Damien's study. He sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, staring at blueprints he could not focus on. Margaret's words from earlier echoed in his mind, unsettling his thoughts no matter how hard he tried to bury them. He had built his life on evidence and logic, not whispers and suspicions, yet both Margaret and Lucy had spoken with the same unshakable certainty. The unease pressed on him like a hand against his chest, and when the quiet knock came at his door, he knew before he looked up who it would be. Lucy stood there with her tablet hugged tightly to her chest. She did not fidget or look away the way nervous children often did. Instead, she held his gaze with a seriousness that felt far older than her 9 years. "I need to show you something," she said softly. Damien hesitated, then gestured her inside. She crossed the room and placed the tablet on his desk with careful hands, as if what she carried was heavier than it looked. The screen lit up, spilling pale light across her face. She tapped swiftly through a maze of applications and graphs until strange colored lines and blinking dots appeared. "I couldn't sleep," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "So I started checking signals around the house. I used to do this in foster homes when things felt wrong. Most devices are normal: phones, laptops, security cameras. But these..." Her small finger pointed to a cluster of red marks pulsing in the corner of the map. "These don't belong to us. They're coming from things Celeste brought." Damien leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The signals were strong and irregular, not connected to his secure network. "What kind of devices?" he asked, though his voice carried a weight that suggested he already dreaded the answer. Lucy swiped to another screen, revealing a list of frequencies and encrypted streams. "They're not normal electronics. They look like transmitters. One is coming from the painting she gave you for your office, another from the vase in the living room. And here," she scrolled quickly to highlight a blinking mark near the master bedroom. "This one's hidden in your nightstand." His chest tightened, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her brown eyes unwavering. "I checked 3 times. These aren't just for spying. They use frequencies that could connect to remote detonation. If something was hidden inside the jet, she could trigger it without even being near." The words struck him like a blow. Damien had spent his career building systems to protect people, designing aircraft meant to withstand threats. Yet here he was blindsided inside his own home. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had considered marrying, might be preparing to destroy not only his creation, but everyone who believed in him. He sat back heavily, blood running cold, his gaze locked on the glowing lines across the screen. For the first time, he let himself feel the truth in Lucy's voice, the truth he had ignored too long. Damien had always trusted Richard Hale more than anyone in his company. Richard had been there from the beginning, when Wolfe Aerospace was nothing more than a dream, sketched on the back of napkins, and late nights in a rented garage. Richard had handled the numbers while Damien chased the vision, and together they had built something that touched the sky. That trust made the unease inside him burn hotter as he began to notice things he had never questioned before. Richard's meetings that did not appear on the official schedule, his sudden habit of taking calls outside the building, the way his eyes sometimes shifted when Celeste's name was mentioned. Damien told himself it was paranoia, yet Lucy's tablet had already shown him enough to know that paranoia might be nothing more than truth he had refused to see. He decided to investigate quietly. A man like him could not afford wild accusations without evidence, not with investors watching and journalists circling. So he watched Richard the way Lucy would have watched, silently, patiently, noting every inconsistency. It did not take long before the cracks widened. Richard claimed to be at a dinner with suppliers one evening, but Damien's own contacts reported he never showed. Another night, he excused himself early from a strategy meeting, his phone buzzing insistently, and Damien followed. That was how he found himself in the shadows of a quiet street, 2 blocks from the company's downtown offices. He sat in his car, lights off, the city moving around him in blurs of neon and rain. Across the street, a cafe glowed dimly, its windows fogged, its chairs half empty. Through the glass, Damien saw Richard sitting in a corner booth, his shoulders hunched slightly forward, his hand gesturing with intensity. Opposite him sat Celeste. Her golden hair was tied back, her expression sharp, her smile nowhere to be seen. Damien's breath caught. He forced himself to stay still, to watch. They leaned close to each other, their voices low, but urgent. Richard slid a folder across the table. Celeste opened it, scanning the pages quickly before closing it again. Damien could not hear the words, but when Celeste's lips formed the phrase, "never makes it home," his heart lurched violently. He read the words as clearly as if they had been shouted. Richard nodded in agreement, his hand tightening into a fist on the table. For a moment, Damien could not move. The betrayal was too sharp, too complete. It was not only Celeste plotting against him, it was Richard too, the man he had trusted with everything. He understood then that the scheme was larger than a single act of sabotage. It was a plan woven through contracts, profits, and foreign interests. Richard was not simply betraying him as a friend. He was selling out the company's future to competitors who would thrive if the WolfeJet X9 vanished in flames. Damien gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. His chest felt heavy, his throat dry. The woman he had loved and the man he had trusted most were working together to destroy him. The knowledge settled like ice in his veins, cold and final. Layers of betrayal, deeper than he had ever imagined, were closing in around him, and he knew that nothing in his life would ever look the same again. The day of the test flight arrived with skies so clear they looked painted, the kind of perfect weather that executives like to point to as a sign of destiny. The WolfeJet X9 gleamed on the runway, its silver body polished to a mirror sheen, the company banners snapping proudly in the breeze. Crowds of investors, journalists, and dignitaries gathered behind velvet ropes, their voices a low chorus of expectation. Damien stood among them in his tailored suit, his eyes fixed on the jet he had spent years creating, but his mind was restless. He had not forgotten the late-night whispers, the tablet evidence Lucy had shown him, or the sight of Richard and Celeste in that cafe. Celeste stayed close to his side, her hand brushing against his arm, her smile radiant as if she had no doubts at all. "You should be on this flight, Damien," she told him softly, though her words carried a sharp edge of insistence. "Think of the confidence it will show. Investors need to see that you believe in your own creation. No one will doubt the safety if you are sitting right there in the cabin with them." He turned his gaze toward her, searching her face. To the crowd she looked flawless, supportive, the image of loyalty. But Damien saw more. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the way her lips tightened when she thought he might refuse. The memory of Lucy's whisper echoed again in his mind. "She'll take it down." His chest tightened, his instincts screaming a warning, yet reason fought back. If he refused, rumors would bloom like weeds. Investors would wonder why their fearless leader had suddenly grown cautious. The stock would suffer. Competitors would circle. Still, hesitation clung to him. He shifted his weight, buying time. "It's standard for test pilots to conduct the maiden voyage," he said, his voice steady though his pulse raced. "I'll join on the second round once data is confirmed." Celeste's hand tightened on his arm, just enough for him to feel the pressure. "Damien, please. This is your legacy. They want to see you lead from the front. Trust me, it will change everything. Trust me." The words struck him harder than intended. He had trusted her, blindly at first, willingly later, and each time the unease inside him had grown. Now, as the engines of the jet began to hum with life, the trap around him seemed to draw tighter. He did not yet know how to prove what he suspected, not without evidence so clear it could not be denied, but he knew that stepping aboard that flight might mean stepping into the end of everything he had built. He forced a smile for the cameras, though his jaw ached from the strain. The flash of bulbs lit the runway, the crowd cheering as if history were already written. Celeste leaned close, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered again, "They will only believe if you are with them." Damien nodded slowly, his stomach twisting. The jet waited like a predator dressed in silver, and though the world saw glory, he felt the shadow of betrayal pressing close. The trap was set, and he stood at its edge, caught between pride and the warning of a child's voice that refused to leave his mind. The house was still when Lucy slipped from her room, the old wooden floor cool under her bare feet. She moved like a shadow, hugging her tablet against her chest as she crept down the hallway toward Damien's office. The heavy door was always kept shut at night, but she had watched enough to know the lock was simple, meant more for privacy than protection. With quick fingers, she used a pin she had hidden in her pocket, the quiet click of the latch almost swallowed by the hum of electronics within. She slipped inside, the air carrying the faint smell of coffee and ink, the glow of screens casting strange shapes across the shelves. Lucy knew she was taking a risk, but her heart pushed her forward. Damien did not believe her, not completely, and if she did nothing, the jet would rise into the sky, carrying him and everyone else straight into disaster. She sat at his desk, her legs dangling far above the ground, and powered up her tablet. Her fingers moved swiftly, copying the tricks she had seen Damien use when checking the security of his networks. She opened the encrypted folder she had traced to Celeste's devices, biting her lip as line after line of code scrolled across the small screen. At first, it was just numbers and symbols, but then the messages began to take shape. She read slowly, her eyes widening as the truth unfolded. Celeste had been writing to contacts under names Lucy did not recognize, addresses that looked like companies, but were filled with words like extraction, disposal, and transfer. One message laid out how the WolfeJet X9 would be sabotaged during its maiden flight, ensuring it would never land safely. Another explained that evidence would be planted to make it look as if Damien himself had been responsible, a desperate executive selling secrets for profit. The final messages described contracts already signed with a foreign nation, agreements to hand over every blueprint, every algorithm, every advantage Damien had built over a lifetime. Lucy felt her throat tighten, the air suddenly too heavy to breathe. She scrolled through images attached to the files, grainy photos of Damien's desk, his passwords scribbled on notepads, confidential reports she had seen him guard with his life. Celeste had photographed them all and sent them away. She saw maps of the hangar, diagrams of the jet, lists of the people who would be on board. Each line cut deeper than the one before, a web of betrayal stretching so wide Lucy could barely hold it in her small head. She pressed a hand over her mouth to stop the cry that wanted to escape. For a moment she thought of closing the tablet and pretending she had never seen. But she knew that was impossible. Damien's life and the lives of everyone on that plane depended on her. She copied the files to her own device, her hands shaking, and whispered to herself that she would not let them win. She was only 9, but she had survived too much to stay silent now. The night was heavy with silence when Lucy slipped out of Damien's office, her small hands clutching her tablet like a shield. She had copied everything she could find, the files still glowing faintly on her screen, and her heart pounded with the weight of what she carried. The hallway stretched before her, dark except for the faint gleam of light from the grand staircase. She told herself to move quickly, to get back to her room and hide the evidence, but halfway down the corridor she froze. Celeste stood at the other end, her golden hair catching the dim light, her expression unreadable. For a long moment neither moved. Then Celeste stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her smile sliding into place like a mask. "What are you doing up, little one?" she asked, her voice warm on the surface but sharp underneath. Lucy tightened her grip on the tablet, her throat dry. She wanted to run, but her legs felt too heavy. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured, hoping her voice sounded casual. Celeste's eyes flicked toward the office door behind Lucy, and something cold flashed across her face. She moved closer, her steps unhurried, her smile turning sharper, as if carved from glass. "You shouldn't play in rooms that aren't yours," she said softly. "It makes people nervous when children wander where they don't belong." Lucy swallowed hard. She had seen this before, in other homes, in the eyes of adults who smiled for the world, but showed their true selves when no one else was watching. Celeste's eyes were hard now, her voice dropping lower. "Stay quiet," she whispered, leaning down so close Lucy could feel the cool brush of her breath. "No one will believe you again. Not him, not anyone. You'll just be the frightened foster child with too many stories." The words cut like knives. Lucy's chest ached, and for a moment she thought she might drop the tablet, her hands trembling with the weight of fear. But then she remembered Damien's face when he had almost believed her, remembered Margaret's quiet strength, and remembered the files she had just copied. She knew she held proof, real proof, and that gave her something Celeste could not take away. "I'm not lying," Lucy whispered, her voice thin but steady. "I know what you're doing." For an instant Celeste's smile slipped, her eyes narrowing like a predator's. Then she straightened, her expression smoothing into perfect calm once more. "Children should be careful about making accusations," she said sweetly. "It can be very dangerous." She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Lucy's cheek, the gesture gentle but threatening in the way it lingered. Then she turned and walked away, her steps light, her shoulders relaxed, as if nothing at all had happened. Lucy stood in the empty hallway, her legs trembling, her breath shaky. Fear pressed in on her, but beneath it burned something stronger, a determination that no threat could erase. She might be small, she might be overlooked, but she carried the truth, and she would not let Celeste's smile silence her again. Lucy waited until the house had grown quiet, until the sounds of footsteps and distant voices faded into the heavy silence of night. She slipped from her room with her tablet pressed tight against her chest, her heart thudding as though it might give her away. Every shadow felt like a threat, every creak in the floor made her flinch, but she knew she could not keep what she had discovered hidden inside her any longer. She padded softly down the back staircase, the one few people used, and found Margaret in the kitchen, folding linens with calm hands. The old woman looked up at once, her eyes sharp despite the late hour. She took in Lucy's pale face, the way her hands shook around the tablet, and set her work aside without asking questions. "Come here, child," she said gently. Lucy climbed onto the stool beside her, her voice trembling as she whispered everything she had seen, the files, the messages, the threats. Margaret listened in silence, her weathered face steady, though her eyes darkened with every word. When Lucy finished, she opened the tablet with quick fingers, showing Margaret the copies she had made. The older woman leaned closer, her glasses catching the glow of the screen, and gave a small nod. "You were right to bring this to me," she murmured, "and brave to gather it at all." She reached out and covered Lucy's hand with her own. "We'll make sure it is safe." Together they worked quietly, Margaret guiding Lucy as she hid copies of the files in places no one would think to look, on a flash drive tucked inside a jar of flour, on a second tablet wrapped in linens, even printed pages folded between stacks of old receipts. Lucy felt a little stronger with each step, as though sharing the burden had lifted some of its weight. Margaret moved with the calm assurance of someone who had spent her life protecting secrets others overlooked, and Lucy realized she was not alone. The next morning, Margaret found Damien in his study, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his desk scattered with papers he had been pretending to read. She closed the door behind her and stood before him, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Wolfe, you need to listen to that child. She risked herself last night to bring me proof of what she has been saying all along. She found messages on Miss Celeste's devices, plans that would put the jet and your name in ruins. She could have been caught, and she was threatened, but she did not stop." Damien looked up sharply, his hands tightening into fists on the desk. Margaret's words struck him harder than he expected. For days he had fought to dismiss Lucy's warnings, telling himself they were childish fears, yet hearing what she had done and how close she had come to danger left his chest aching. "Show me," he said. Margaret handed him the tablet, the screen lighting his face as he scrolled through the evidence. Each message burned into him, the betrayal undeniable. He sat in silence for a long time, the sound of his own breathing loud in the stillness. Finally, he looked up, his voice low. She was right. I should have listened. The morning of the flight dawned bright and sharp, the sky washed clean by a night of rain. The WolfeJet X9 gleamed on the runway, its silver body reflecting the rising sun like a promise. Inside the private lounge, Damien paced the carpet with restless steps, his mind caught between the weight of evidence and the pull of doubt. Margaret's words and Lucy's bravery had left him shaken, but years of discipline made him second-guess everything. He had spent his life building walls against fear, and now those walls were cracking. Celeste entered the room as if she floated, her pale suit flawless, her hair falling in soft waves around her face. She carried a small leather bag over her arm, elegant and unassuming, and smiled when she saw him, though her eyes searched his face too closely. "Damien," she said, her voice warm, "you look tense. This is a day of triumph, not worry. The whole world will be watching you. You mustn't let nerves spoil it." He stopped pacing and faced her, his hands tightening behind his back. "There are things I need to ask you," he said evenly. Her smile softened with practiced sorrow. "Of course. What troubles you?" He hesitated, the words heavy in his throat. "Where were you last night?" The question startled her only for a heartbeat, then she let out a delicate laugh. "Really, Damien, you sound like an old jealous husband. I was here, sleeping, waiting for this day. Surely you don't mean to question me now." But he pressed on, his voice sharper. "Why have you been carrying devices into my house? Why are there signals coming from gifts you've given me? And why, Celeste, did I see you meeting with Richard behind my back?" The air seemed to tighten. Celeste's eyes widened with perfect hurt, her lips trembling. Tears welled as she stepped closer. "How could you think that of me? Damien, you know me. You know I love you. Richard is your closest friend. I only met him to plan something special for you. And as for signals and devices, I don't even understand such things. Have you been listening to a child again?" The word child twisted something in Damien's chest. He thought of Lucy, small and serious, risking herself to bring him proof. Celeste's tears were convincing, her voice breaking just enough to seem true, but the echo of Lucy's certainty cut through the performance. At that moment, the door opened and Lucy stepped inside, Margaret close behind her. The girl clutched her tablet, but her voice was steady as she looked at Damien, not Celeste. "Check her bag," she said simply. The room froze. Celeste's hand tightened on the leather strap, her expression flickering before smoothing into shock. "This is outrageous," she cried, turning to Damien with desperate eyes. "You cannot humiliate me like this in front of strangers. She is unstable. She makes up stories because she wants your attention." Security guards at the door shifted uneasily, waiting for a command. Damien's heart pounded, his mind racing between doubt and truth, between love and betrayal. Lucy's eyes never wavered. "Check her bag," Damien said at last, his voice firm. The order broke the spell. The guards moved forward and Celeste's protests filled the room, loud and frantic, but the calm certainty in Lucy's small voice echoed louder in Damien's heart than all of Celeste's tears. The guards moved with steady hands, unzipping the smooth leather bag that Celeste clutched against her chest. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, even Damien, who had convinced himself that perhaps Lucy was wrong, that perhaps he had let suspicion twist his judgment. Then the contents spilled onto the table in a cruel avalanche of truth. Sleek black devices, wires coiled neatly around compact blocks, a digital timer glowing faintly red, circuits designed for one purpose only. The silence cracked open. Gasps erupted from the staff and security. Shouts rose from the hallway where guests waited, and Damien's own chest clenched, as though someone had struck him. He had built planes to withstand storms and engines that defied limits. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the sight of death sitting casually in the bag carried by the woman he once imagined he would marry. Celeste's mask did not slip at first. She pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide with a performance so perfect it would have fooled anyone who had not already seen through her. "This isn't mine," she cried, her voice trembling. Someone planted this, Damien. You have to believe me. But Damien saw what others missed. He saw the calculation flicker too quickly in her eyes, the way her hand clenched instead of shaking, the way her voice caught only when she thought of what to say next. He saw the truth in the details, the same way Lucy always had. The guards pulled her back, but Celeste straightened suddenly, her body stiff with fury. The tears dried on her cheeks in an instant, her lips curling into a sneer. The mask dropped fully now, shattering into pieces at their feet. Her eyes went cold and sharp, stripped of every ounce of charm. She turned on Damien with a voice like venom. "You should have married smarter," she hissed. "You were too easy." A man so obsessed with his machines that he never saw the woman beside him tearing it all apart. You built your empire out of numbers and wires, Damien, but you left your heart exposed, and that was your weakness. The room spun with chaos around them. Security rushed to secure the devices, barking into radios. Margaret pulled Lucy protectively against her, and aides whispered frantically into their phones. Yet Damien stood rooted in place, his face pale but his eyes locked on the woman who had played him so carefully. Celeste leaned forward, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear. "If that plane had gone down, you would have been remembered as the fool who killed his own dream, and I would have been long gone before anyone pieced it together." Damien's breath came slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked at her, at the hollow cruelty that had replaced the softness he once believed was real. The humiliation, the betrayal, the danger she had placed not just on him, but on countless lives, burned through him like fire. The hangar beyond the room was in uproar, but Damien only heard Lucy's whisper echoing once more in his mind, the whisper he had tried to dismiss. "She'll take it down." And now, staring at the evidence laid bare, he knew the child had saved them all. The hangar trembled with noise as security scrambled to contain the devices found in Celeste's bag. The polished calm of the morning had shattered, leaving only the harsh echoes of shouts and the sharp click of boots on the steel floor. Damien stood frozen in the center of it, his mind spinning as he stared at the explosives now spread out on the table, blinking like silent accusations. For years he had built an empire on precision and foresight, yet betrayal had slipped into his own home, hidden in smiles and whispered promises. The sudden arrival of sirens cut through the chaos. Black SUVs screeched to a stop outside, their doors flying open as men and women in dark jackets surged into the hangar. The yellow letters on their backs left no room for doubt. FBI agents, armed and organized, swept into the room with the kind of efficiency that made everyone step back. Investors, staff, and journalists pressed against the walls, their shocked whispers falling into silence as the agents took control. Margaret appeared at Damien's side, calm even as the scene unraveled. She spoke quietly, her words steady. "I sent them everything Lucy uncovered. Every message, every file. They were waiting for your word, but I knew we could not afford to wait any longer." Damien turned to look at her, then at Lucy, who clutched her tablet to her chest, her small face pale but unflinching. He wanted to speak, to tell her what her courage had meant, but the words caught in his throat. The agents moved quickly. Two approached Celeste, who stood straight with her hands folded as though still at a gala. Her smile was gone, replaced by a cold defiance that made the room seem colder still. When the cuffs clicked around her wrists, she lifted her chin, her voice sharp enough to carry. "Do you think this will stop what's coming?" He was never strong enough to protect what he built. Her words hung in the air like smoke, but the agents pushed her forward, ignoring her as she spat her venom at Damien. Richard appeared moments later, pulled from a side office where he had been cornered. His suit was rumpled, his face pale, his eyes darting everywhere except at Damien. The man who had been his partner, his confidant, the one who managed the lifeblood of his empire, now stood exposed. The agents read his rights as investors watched in horrified silence, realizing they had nearly poured fortunes into a company seconds from ruin. Damien's breath came slowly, his chest tight as he watched them both led away in handcuffs. Rage and grief twisted inside him, but stronger than either was the sickening knowledge of how close he had come to losing everything. The jet that gleamed like the future of aviation had been one heartbeat from destruction, his name seconds from disgrace. If Lucy had not spoken, if Margaret had not acted, the world would have written his story as tragedy instead of survival. The crowd remained hushed, the only sound the fading echo of sirens. Damien looked at Lucy at last, her small figure steady against the storm, and felt the weight of what he owed her settle deep in his bones. Weeks passed after the arrests, yet the memory of that day lingered in every corner of Damien's mind. The hanger, the handcuffs, the betrayal written in Richard's pale face, the venom in Celeste's last words, all of it had left scars. But time has a way of softening sharp edges, and in those weeks, Damien found himself looking at his world differently. The empire he had nearly lost was still standing, stronger for the truth that had come to light. Investors returned cautiously, reassured by the swift justice and the security measures that followed. Yet Damien's focus no longer lived in boardrooms or runways. It lived in the quiet halls of his home, where a little girl's voice and an old woman's laughter brought a warmth he had not known he was missing. The day of Lucy's adoption was bright and simple, nothing like the grand ceremonies he was accustomed to. No cameras, no reporters, no investors in sharp suits. Just Damien, Lucy, Margaret, and a judge who smiled kindly as she signed the papers. When the final stroke of ink sealed the decision, Damien looked at the certificate, but it was not the paper that struck him. It was the way Lucy's small hand slipped into his, not tentative this time, not uncertain, but sure and steady. She belonged here, not because of signatures or law, but because trust had been built in nights of fear and mornings of truth. Back at the mansion, the changes were unmistakable. What once had been a house of glass and silence now held life. The sterile walls of Lucy's room had been covered with her drawings, taped in messy rows that spilled out into the hallway. Planes sketched in bold colors, people drawn with crooked smiles, even Margaret standing tall with her hair tied back. Damien had tried at first to suggest frames, something tidy and proper, but Lucy's grin as she stuck another paper directly to the wall had disarmed him. He let her do it her way, and soon the house began to feel like something real. Margaret, too, seemed lighter. She hummed as she worked, laughter slipping into conversations where before she had only nodded. Sometimes Damien would hear her and Lucy whispering in the kitchen late at night, their voices weaving together like family had always been there, only waiting to be noticed. For Damien, who had spent years measuring life in profits and deadlines, the sound of that laughter was worth more than any contract. One evening he sat in the library, the same room where Margaret had once begged him to listen, and watched Lucy at the desk where he used to drown in work. She was bent over her tablet, her tongue poking out in concentration as she drew a jet with wings too wide for the page. Margaret sat nearby knitting, her needles clicking softly. Damien felt something he had never truly felt in this house before, a stillness that was not empty but full of presence, of connection, of belonging. He realized then that family was not made by obligation or by duty. It was not something bought with money or arranged with contracts. Family was forged in trust, in standing together when betrayal pressed close, in believing the small voice when it spoke the truth. And as Lucy looked up and caught his gaze with a smile that reached her eyes, Damien knew that his life had been rebuilt not with steel or engines, but with something far stronger. The house was quiet that night, the kind of quiet Damien used to find unsettling. In the past, silence reminded him of isolation, of deals stretching into the early hours, of empty rooms echoing with nothing but the sound of his own footsteps. Now the quiet carried a different weight, not loneliness, but peace. The gentle stillness of a home that breathed softly around him. He sat at his desk, a stack of reports glowing faintly on the screen in front of him, though his focus slipped often, his eyes wandering to the drawings taped across the walls. Planes, stars, crooked little figures, bright splashes of color on paper that seemed to bring warmth into every corner. Lucy had been asleep when he began working, or at least he thought she had. He remembered tucking her in, Margaret smiling knowingly as she watched him fumble with the blanket in a way that showed how new this was for him. But children had their own rhythm, and Lucy's was unpredictable, a mix of curiosity and quiet courage. So when he heard the soft pad of her steps on the library floor, he was not surprised, only a little amused. She crossed the room slowly, clutching her small blanket, her hair tumbling around her face. Without a word, she climbed into the chair beside him and curled up like she had always belonged there. Damien looked at her, his stern expression softening the way it always did when she was near. He wanted to tell her to go back to bed, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he let her settle beside him as he returned to his work, the soft glow of the desk lamp wrapping them both in light. For a long moment, there was only the sound of keys clicking and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Then, in a whisper so small it might have gone unnoticed, Lucy leaned closer and said, "Don't forget your coffee." He paused, his hand still on the keyboard, and then a quiet laugh escaped him. The coffee was sitting on the table beside him, forgotten and cooling, but that was not what her words meant. They carried more than a reminder, more than the simple observation of a child. They carried care, the gentle nudge of someone who had learned to watch and to listen, the small voice that had saved him more than once. He turned to look at her, and in her eyes he saw the same determination that had once cut through deception, the same honesty that had guided him when he nearly lost everything. For years he had trusted only numbers, contracts, and control, but none of that had protected him as much as the truth spoken from her lips. Her voice had been the difference between ruin and redemption, and tonight it reminded him again that his fortune was not built in glass towers or boardrooms. It was here, in the whisper of a child who had chosen to trust him, and whom he had finally learned to trust in return. As she drifted against his arm, her breath evening into sleep, Damien leaned back in his chair and let the quiet fill him. He knew then that the truest sound in his life was not applause or approval, not the clink of glasses in a deal, or the roar of jets in the sky. It was this, the whisper of a little girl, reminding him of something as simple as coffee, a whisper that had changed everything. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.